So one of the things is like, why should we care about memory? Why do I care about it? I want to look at the disk. That's where the goods are, right? But the thing is that you'll see is that that isn't necessarily the case. That memory or information in memory is really a snapshot of the state of the machine at that time, right? So it's giving you kind of what's running on the machine, what's actually being conducted on the machine, which is really, really helpful when you're trying to understand things like running processes, what running processes were doing, what their components were or contents were, and this is where it really becomes beneficial. But it's also important when you're dealing with things like incident response. You mentioned yesterday that you have kind of a scripting mechanism which will go through and gather a bunch of system information, right? And what you'll see is that, and we'll kind of touch on this. You'll see it in practice. Is that sometimes IR tools aren't giving you an accurate representation of the information that's actually on the system, right? And that's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, that kind of differential, the data not being there, is evidence in itself, right? So they complement each other, but it's important that you have both in order to be able to do that complement. It's also important to note that memory is volatile, right? So if you power down the system, you're basically losing memory. I know yesterday we talked about afterlife. We talked about kind of the approach of collecting data or memory after a machine has been shut off. But I think for all intents and purposes, consider memory to be volatile. But it'll contain information about actual process content. It'll contain things like chat communications, emails, documents that maybe aren't saved to disk but are being held in memory. It can also give you things like network connections and open ports that are on the system, as well as anything with rootkits or hidden processes that wouldn't be represented by IR tools and things like that. And kind of one of the things that people often look for is encryption keys or passphrases. One important note is that if you have an encrypted disk or an encrypted container that's open, the key has to be in there, has to be in memory someplace. Because in order for the application to interpret the encrypted data, it needs the key to decrypt it, right? So either the passphrase or key has to be in there somewhere. And one of the things I want to point out, though, is we're going to focus primarily on memory for malware analysis and kind of in incident response and things like that. But it's not just for malware, right? You can get a lot of information out of that: chat communications, emails, documents, things like that. So it can be really beneficial, and it all is going to depend on your case. So one of the common areas where we're going to be interested in memory is the measure of the counter forensics principle. There's kind of an increasing recognition, and I think that probably everybody in this room is aware that that the hard drive does not equal computer, right? That there are other components that can contain information. And if you don't understand that by the end of this class, hopefully you will. But that there are kind of increasing counterforensic techniques that will prevent data from actually being written to disk, such as, and Metasploit is a great example, which is freely available and you can download and use. Will have payloads that run entirely in memory, where no actual contents are written to disk. You can have rootkits that'll basically hide themselves in kernel modules and things like that. And then one of the real benefits to memory analysis is when you're dealing with packed or encrypted malware. So when this becomes beneficial is that if it's packed or encrypted on disk, how do you analyze it, right? You'd have to reverse engineer it. It becomes a little bit more complicated, obviously. But if you're dealing with packed or encrypted malware in memory, then there at least needs to be, some or all of the file needs to be unpacked or decrypted, because it needs to be read, right? So in order for the operating system to interpret it, in order for the associated applications to read its data, the data needs to be unpacked or decrypted, right? That may be a section of the file, depending on how the application is written, or it may be the entire thing, but something to kind of keep in mind. So memory can give you access to those components. Encryption is a really common example, right? And I kind of brought up the concept of passphrases and passwords and stuff like that. Actually, encryption keys lying in memory. But I don't think it's any new news that encryption has increased usage, right? My computers are all encrypted. I assume that you have most of your stuff encrypted. Most operating systems have built-in, and I think all operating systems now have built-in capabilities of doing full disk or volume-based encryption. So it's something that's prevalent and easy to use, right? In the past, it wasn't as useful because processors were slow and they couldn't, and disks were slow and they couldn't do the decryption quick enough. It became inefficient for that means, right? So you'd mostly do it on a file basis. But now with quad core and quad core processors and so on and so forth, and i7 and everything else, you can have you can process a lot more data quickly. Disks are faster when you're dealing with like solid state disks and things like that. So you're able to perform. So it's just much more commonplace, I guess, is my point. So kind of focusing on the topics we said yesterday. When you're dealing with encryption, it's best to kind of grab a snapshot of that disk in its decrypted state if you can, right? If you have interactive access to the desktop. But if you don't, but you can get a memory image, is that you can often pull a key or a passphrase out of memory, which can certainly be helpful to decrypting later on. And kind of one of the points that I really want to stress is the efficiency component, right? And this is what we're going to be primarily focusing on, and that is that it's much more manageable to look at a gig of memory or 4 gigs or 8 gigs or 16 gigs of memory than it is to look at 2 terabytes or 4 terabytes or 10 terabytes of disk data, right? It's just a smaller amount of data. It's easier to look through, right? So this is really where we can use kind of memory analysis to focus our disk analysis. By the anomalies that we detect or the suspicious files or suspicious activity that we detect, we can then use that to kind of focus our disk analysis. So we're not looking at 10 terabytes of data, but we're looking at specific components of that 10 terabytes. So it's going to be much more manageable. But that being said, I mean, memory space is growing kind of exponentially as well, which is creating issues too for that.